Finland's beautiful Lake Bodom is a Finnish lake located in the city of Espoo, not far from Helsinki. The lake measures approximately 3 kilometers in length and 1 kilometer in width. It is surrounded by 5 districts in Espoo: Kanala in the west, Roila in the north, Bodom in the northeast, Hognes in the southeast, and Kahusuo in the southwest. Between June and August, the sun does not set, temperatures soar, and the Finns of all ages flock to the lake to celebrate the arrival of summer and the passing of the long, freezing winter. It was in the carefree spirit that, on June 4, 1960, 4 teenagers decided to have an adventure on the lake's tranquil shore. "15-year-olds Meila Emeli Björklund and Anja Tuulikki of Espoo, Finland, set out for an evening of fishing and camping with their 18-year-old boyfriends Seppo Antero Boisman and Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson. Seppo had managed to get some alcohol and black market condoms for the night ahead. After riding their motorcycles to Lake Bodom from their hometown of Vantaa, the teenagers chose a spot shaded by birch trees along the idyllic Finnish bay. Their motorcycles were parked beside the tent, and they were positioned on a slight slope by the shade. They spent the evening chatting, swimming, and fishing, completely oblivious to the horrors that would soon unfold at their campsite. At 10:30 p.m., both couples, Seppo Boisman and Tuulikki and Nils Gustafsson and Emeli Björklund, retired to bed. Sometime between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., Meila Emeli Björklund and Anja Tuulikki, both 15 years old, and Seppo Boisman, 18 years old, were brutally attacked by an unknown assailant. At about 6 a.m., a group of boys bird-watching some distance away had reportedly seen the tent collapse and a blond man walking away from the site. The bodies of the victims were discovered at about 11 a.m. by a carpenter named Esko Oiva Johansson. He alerted the police, who arrived on the scene at noon. The local authorities determined that the killer had not injured the victims from inside the tent, but instead had attacked the occupants from outside with a knife and an unidentified blunt instrument, possibly a rock, through the sides of the tent. Seppo Antero Boisman's body was found inside the tent. He had been stabbed 3 times with a knife, 2 times in the throat, and 1 time downwards in the lung. Also, Boisman's head had been crushed with a blunt object. Anya Tuliki Moki's body was partly on top of Boisman's body, and upon the canvas in a fetal position. Moki had been killed outside the tent with 2 blows by a blunt object. Splatter of Moki's blood was found on the outer surface of the tent, and on Nils Gustafsson's shoes that were left outside of the tent over the night. Also a towel had been placed over Moki's head and upper body. Moki had not died immediately after the blows to the head, and she lived maybe 2 or 3 hours after the attack. Mela Emeli Björklund's body was partly on top of Moki's body. Björklund had been killed inside the tent, with possibly 3 blunt object blows in the head. After she was already dead, the perpetrator had pulled her out of the tent, and had pulled her pants down exposing her genital. He had also stabbed her 15 times in the neck and back area. Also, a pillowcase that had semen on it was found from the scene. It is not certain if the pillowcase had belonged to the victims or not. The semen has been tested for DNA in year 2000 and it did not belong to the victims, or to the victims' relatives, or to some of the suspects. All of the suspects haven't been tested to this day. Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson was lying on top of Björklund's body barefoot, and in shock. He was alive, but bloody and unconscious, and his bloody face was covered with flies. Cerebrospinal fluid was coming out of his nose. The hospital had documented the following injuries for Gustafsson right after he was brought to hospital. He had 3 blunt force traumas in the left side of his face. One of these blows had broken his upper and lower jaw from the left side of the centerline of the jaw. One of the blows had broken his left cheekbone. One of the blows had broken his left temple. He also developed a double black eye, and the doctors believed that the base of his skull had been broken. Then there were 3 stab wounds that had been documented. One of these had pierced his left cheek, so that his teeth were visible through his cheek. One was in the corner of his eye, but the blade had not injured his eye. The 3rd documented knife wound was in the backside of his upper left arm, near the shoulder joint. Nils Gustafsson was the only survivor of the massacre. He claimed that he was attacked first. He became disoriented during the attack, but caught a glimpse of the attacker clothed in black and red with bright eyes. The killer had taken several items which police found puzzling, including clothes, like Seppo's leather jacket, money, and the keys to Boisman's motorcycles, which was left behind. Gustafsson's shoes were partially hidden approximately 500 meters from the murder site. The police did not cordon off the site nor record the details of the scene, later seen as a major error, and almost immediately allowed a crowd of police officers and other people to trample around and disturb the evidence. The mistake was further exacerbated by calling in soldiers to assist with the search around the lake for the missing items, several of which were never found. Some clothing belonging to the group was found covered in blood around 500 meters away from the murder site. The murder weapons would never be found. Despite extensive investigations, the perpetrator was never identified, and various theories on the killer's identity have been presented over the years. There have been numerous suspects over the course of the investigation of the Lake Bodom murders, but the following are the most notable. Before we move on to suspects and theories, it is imperative that we note that defensive wounds were found on all of the victims' hands and arms, indicating that they had fought for their lives. It should also be noted that Mela Emeli Björklund's diary was found near the campsite. The last entry read, "Seppo and Nils are drunk, awake at 2 a.m. Seppo is fishing." Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, a kiosk keeper from Oita, was the police's most viable suspect. However, police found no hard evidence to link him to the actual murders. According to reports, Gillstrom confessed to the murders to his neighbor while intoxicated, although he later denied doing so. Gillstrom, a spiteful man, carried an intense hatred of children and campers. Gillstrom's wife provided his alibi for the night of the murders, claiming that Gillstrom was in bed all night. However, this statement was later retracted, asserting that her husband threatened to kill her if she implicated him in the murders. The people in the town knew Carl Valdemar Gillstrom was violent, cut down tents, threw rocks at people who came to his street, and some later said that it was Carl Valdemar Gillstrom they saw coming back from the murder scene the morning of June 6, but were too afraid to call the police about him. In a particularly haunting exchange, Gillstrom told a friend of his, Borge, that he killed the teens, but Borge didn't believe him. When Gillstrom asked what he should do if he were responsible, Borge said, "You should drown yourself, because you'll be spending the rest of your life in prison." A few hours later, Gillstrom returned to Lake Bodom, where he drowned himself. The police never recovered DNA from Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, or any of his descendants. Most public suspicion focused on Hans Assmann, a German-born naturalized Finnish citizen and reported KGB spy, who lived several kilometers from the shore of Lake Bodom. However, Hans Assmann had an alibi for the night of the Bodom murders, and was said to have been in Germany. On the morning of Monday, June 6, 1960, however, he had shown up at a hospital in Helsinki Surgical Hospital in an extremely delirious state with bloody clothes. He spoke incoherently, and his fingernails appeared dirted black. At points, Assmann pretended to be unconscious as a way to manipulate the doctors into seeing him quicker than the other patients. When this didn't work, Assmann became hostile towards staff and patients, and subsequently told to leave. Interestingly, on the morning of the Lake Bodom murders, 2 children claimed to have seen a blonde man fleeing the crime scene around the time the murders occurred. Assmann, it turns out, had long blonde hair at the time of the Lake Bodom killings. When this information became public knowledge, Astman reportedly shaved hair completely bald. Additionally, the clothing that Astman wore when he entered the hospital that morning matched the children's description. Nevertheless, it seems unlikely that he did the killings, as he was working as painter, and he had a painting job in Helsinki, and he stayed with his mistress in Helsinki during that time. Also, the hospital where he went was located near his workplace and his girlfriend's apartment. So Astman was not staying near the Lake Bodom when the murders happened. He moved to Sweden, where he also died in the late 1990s. Hans Astman was also a suspect in 5 other cases, even confessing to one on his deathbed. A descendant of Hans Astman provided a DNA sample to exclude Hans as a suspect going forward. The results indicated that the DNA from the semen on the pillowcase found at the scene of the crime did not belong to Hans Astman. In late March 2004, almost 44 years after the event, Niels Gustafsson was arrested. In early 2005, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation declared the case was solved based on new forensic analysis. According to the prosecution's interpretation of the bloodstains, Gustafsson had been drunk and excluded from the tent when he attacked the other boy, getting his jaw broken in a fight, which escalated into him committing the 3 murders. The trial started on the 4th of August 2005. Niels Gustafsson's defense lawyer argued that the murders were the work of one or more outsiders, and that Niels Gustafsson would have been incapable of killing 3 people given the extent of his injuries. It had always been known that the shoes worn by the killer and hidden by him 450 meters, 500 yards, away from the tent belonged to Niels Gustafsson, who was found barefoot on top of the tent. Modern DNA analysis was significant for the prosecution, as it showed blood samples from each of the victims on Gustafsson's shoes. The prosecution ascertained that Gustafsson erupted in a jealous rage over an incident with his new girlfriend, Emilie Björklund. There are no specific details about why Gustafsson would explode in such a manner. Gustafsson then arranged the crime scene, removed Björklund's trousers, and inflicted stab wounds on himself, to give the impression of a frenzied sex attack by a mad knifeman. Gustafsson's girlfriend, Björklund, suffered the most stab wounds, which suggested a personal vendetta. They say a key piece of prosecution evidence is Gustafsson's shoes, on which British forensic scientists found traces of the victim's blood. Gustafsson's injuries had occurred at a different time to the attack on the murdered victims. The only explanation of this was that Niels Gustafsson had committed the murders and then faked the theft of items by hiding them, further injured himself, and then went back to the tent where, now barefoot, he pretended to be unconscious. The prosecution attempted to bolster their case by alleging an identification by 2 birdwatchers of Niels Gustafsson as the tall blonde man at the scene of the crime, an assertion that he had been overheard making an incriminating remark, and also that a decade after the event he had boasted to a woman about his guilt. In the hearings, the jury heard from written witness statements and accounts from birdwatchers and anglers who were as young as 11 in 1960 that identified Niels Gustafsson as the blonde man they saw around the tent in the early morning of June 5. Also, a woman who was camping nearby with friends on the night of the murders claimed Gustafsson and Boy's man had visited her tent during the evening of the murders, and that Gustafsson had been drunk and behaved aggressively. However, Gustafsson's defense stated that Gustafsson had been inside the tent when he got the injuries, and that DNA proved that a large amount of Gustafsson's blood was found from the spot where Gustafsson had slept in the tent. After this, he had either himself came out of the tent, or the perpetrator had pulled him out. Gustafsson also stated that the party did not visit another tent. Also, Björklund's diary did not mention the visit as well. Gustafsson's lawyer claimed the prosecution had no motive, and that a number of items disappeared from the murder scene and were never found. And the most revealing was that only Anja Tuulikki-Moki's blood splatter was found on Gustafsson's shoes was also later found inside of Nils Gustafsson's shoes. On the 7th of October 2005, Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The court explained the verdict as due to the prosecution's evidence being inconclusive, failure to show Gustafsson had a motive appropriate to a crime of such extreme seriousness, and certainty about the facts now being impossible given the time that had elapsed. The state of Finland paid him 44,900 euros for the mental suffering caused by the long remand time, but the public prosecutor refused to sue Finnish newspapers for defamation. Nils Gustafsson did not use his right to bring charges against the newspapers as an injured party.
What are my thoughts on this baffling case? I'm torn on this, but I believe that Carl Valdemar Gyllström is most likely the culprit. A few things have led me to that conclusion. First, Gyllström's wife initially provided his alibi for the night of the murders. However, she later retracted the statement, now asserting that her husband had threatened to kill her if she had implicated him in the murders. Second, the people in the nearby area knew Carl Valdemar Gyllström to be a violent individual who had cut down tents and threw rocks at people who came to Lake Bodom in the past. But for me, the most damning thing was that some people present at Lake Bodom said that it was Carl Valdemar Gyllström they saw coming back from the murder scene the morning of slayings, but were too afraid to call the police on him. This bit of information, coupled with the recanted alibi, informed my decision. Also, when you include the fact that his descendants have not consented to a DNA test, if only to clear Carl Valdemar Gyllström's name, speaks volumes. So what was the motive? The noises coming from the tent in the early morning by the teens irritated him, and he went out to put a stop to it. As he approached the tent, Anja Tuulikki-Moki had stepped out of the tent to use the bathroom. Moki was killed outside the tent with 2 blows by a blunt object, possibly a large rock. She dropped to the ground and curled herself into a fetal position. Splatter of Moki's blood was found on the outer surface of the tent and on and inside Nils Gustafsson's shoes that were left outside of the tent overnight. Realizing what he had done, Gyllström then attacked the occupants of the tent with the rock. Blood splatters from Mila Ermeli Björklund, Seppo Antero Boiman, and Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson were found inside the tent. He placed Anja Tuulikki-Moki back inside the tent on top of Seppo. Then he noticed Mila Ermeli Björklund and pulled her out of the tent with the intent to assault her. He pulled Mila Ermeli Björklund's pants down. She began to fight back, and he stabbed her 15 times in the neck and back to get her to comply. He then ejaculated into Molly's pillowcase and tossed it to the ground. He started hearing noises coming from the male victims and used a small knife to stab each of them. He stabbed Seppo Antero Boiman 3 times with the knife, twice in the throat and once in the lung. He then stabbed Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson 3 times, once in his left cheek, another in the corner of his eye, but the blade had not injured his eye. The third knife wound was in the backside of his upper left arm near the shoulder joint, as Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson had instinctively tried to defend himself. In the commotion, Kyle had pulled Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson out of the tent and dumped his body on top of Mila. Carl Valdemar Gillström began rummaging through the teenager's things, ultimately taking Seppo's leather jacket and motorcycle keys. He tossed the rock and knife into Lake Bodom and walked quietly back toward his home. However, he was spotted by a few people in the area as he made his trek home. Most people involved with the mysterious Lake Bodom murders have since passed on, taking what little knowledge of the incident they have to their graves. The killer will most likely never face justice, and the question of who brutally murdered 3 Finnish teenagers in 1960 will remain unanswered. Thank you for your time. True crime stories are my passion, and will continue to make videos involving older cases spread throughout the world. If you like what I do, please feel free to like the video and subscribe. My goal is to get to 200 subscribers by the end of the year, so every little bit helps. Enjoy the rest of your day. Essentials.